Tonight's program I call 5 Sketches About Slavery in Westport. Most of the presentations we do are about aspects of the town's history that we're proud of. Not so with tonight's topic. Slavery and slave trade are ugly subjects, but they're real and they're important, and they did happen here. It's not that slavery is a secret in town. It's not that we haven't known about it. It's not being revealed for the first time, although a few of the things that I'll talk about may be new. But there's been a lot of research into this. Recently, Betty Slade, Dave Cole, Richard Gifford have done some wonderful research into Paul Cuffey's father. And Betty in particular has done a number of things like the Stevens family and so forth. So there are things as we research the Handy House, we came on slavery there. So it's not that it's a secret, but much of this history is not well known. There's still a lot more research to do, and we're hoping that over time that research will get done and integrated into the narrative of Westport's overall history. The stories that I'm going to tell tonight are really sketches, as I call them. They're incomplete in some cases because we just don't know anymore. In other cases because we know there's more, but the research hasn't been done. I hope this will inspire a continued conversation about slavery and race in our town's past. The 5 stories I have are not, they're not related to each other, except for the common theme. So I'm just going to present them chronologically. The first one is about slave owning itself, which technically speaking never happened in Westport. Seems odd, but the reason it didn't happen is because Westport was incorporated in 1787. And 4 years before that, slavery was outlawed in Massachusetts. So technically speaking, no one who lived in the town of Westport owned slaves, at least in any way that we know. Before that, though, of course, Westport was part of Dartmouth, and the part that we call Westport now was the Ocoxit section of Dartmouth, and there was definitely slave owning there. There was a census of slavery in Massachusetts in 1754, town by town. There were about 5,000 slaves in Massachusetts at that time, maybe a larger number than people might have thought. And there were 34 adult slaves over the age of 16, in Dartmouth. We don't know how many of them would have been in the Ocoxit section. We do know that that was 1754. In the 1760s and 70s, slavery increased significantly. In Bristol County in those 2 decades, slaveholding more than quadrupled. So we know that the number of slaves here in Westport was significant. But until we've done a complete census of genealogical data and probate data and so forth, we won't have an exact number. Quite a few Westport prominent families owned slaves. Keep in mind that this was perfectly legal. The earliest was probably Richard Sisson, who's often listed as the first settler at the head of Westport. When he died in 1684, he owned 1 African slave and 1 Indian slave. Other families include the Cadmans, the Whites, the Laughtons, the Almies, the Richmonds, the Coreys. Again, this was all perfectly legal. I'm going to concentrate tonight on the White family because we know something about their slaves and also because of their connection with the Cadman White Handy House. George Cadman built the Handy House for his daughter Elizabeth and her husband William White around 1712. We know that George Cadman owned a slave named James who was freed in George Cadman's will. Not right away, but after a period of 3 3/4 years. We don't know why. Because the slave reached a certain age, like 21. It was because that was a certain term of service, 20 years. We don't know. We simply don't know. It seems odd, but there was obviously a reason for it. We don't know if Elizabeth Cadman, the first inhabitant of the handy house, had slaves herself. She had obviously grown up with them at some point. It's possible, I mean, she was an only child, she didn't have any brothers and sisters, and she had 11 children, so she was clearly in need of help. Whether they had slaves, we just simply don't have any data on that. It would be intriguing to find out. But we do know that their son George, who was a blacksmith like his father, George White, did have slaves. His will, which was in 1762, specifies that 2 slaves, one named Zip and one named Violet, will be freed in March of 1766. So roughly 4 years, 3.5, 4 years. So again, some period of time ahead. Again, we don't know why. Probably wasn't because of age, because there were 2 of them. It's unlikely they were the same age. But it may have to do with terms of service, or just to give the family a certain amount of time to get used to the fact that they're going to be going away. We know only a little bit about Violet, that she married a man named Pero Snell sometime after she was freed. Zip, we know a little bit more about. He was formerly owned by the Lawton family. And he married a woman named Elizabeth David, who was a Wampanoag woman from, I'm not sure, was she from Dartmouth? Okay, she wasn't from and they married, according to the dates we have, the year before he was free. So he was in that period where it must have been a very tough period for him, knowing he was going to be free, but not free yet. But they married during that time. And they had 2 children, 2 daughters. The older one, named Jane, married Paul Cuffey's brother, John. So here we have, this is interesting, a black Wampanoag woman marrying a black Wampanoag man. And you'll see this quite a bit in our history. Their second daughter was the well-known herbalist and healer, Charlotte. So Zip might have led himself a life of servitude and relative obscurity, but his daughter was remembered in the name of one of the major streets in town. A third slave named Dinah White does not show up in his will, but she shows up in the town records, 1789, so the second year that Westport was a town. And she shows up because she's in need of poor relief. One of the things that these towns always had to worry about was poor relief, and they would go back and forth with Dartmouth. You know, this person's on poor relief, but she's not from here, or he's not from here, they're from your town, and they would argue back and forth. In the case of Dinah, what's in the town records is a Negro woman laid the property of George White, deceased, of Dartmouth, now residing in the town of Westport, not in a capacity to support herself, and the heirs of the said George White, though requested, refused to support the said Dinah. So the family said, we're not responsible. She's not our property. She was. Once upon a time, she's not our property. And the town felt that because of her condition, former condition of slavery, she should be supported by the family. Luckily, other citizens came to her poor relief and took care of her, but they would also appeal to the town to be reimbursed. If you were in care of the poor in any way, you would get reimbursed for that from the town. It's the way poor relief worked in those days. But these appeals for reimbursement were also denied by the town. And 12 years later, this was still in the town records. It's still going on 12 years later, unresolved. So Dinah might have been free, but the lingering effects of slavery certainly haunted the rest of her days. I will add one postscript. The Coreys, as I mentioned, had 2 slaves, which were freed in 1780 and 1783. One named Glasgow went back to Rhode Island, where he had family, and the other, Jupiter, was given a cottage to live in the Horseneck Dunes for the rest of his life. The second story is about Barney Hicks. You may know that name. Just down the road here, a couple miles on the right-hand side, is the Barney Hicks farm. Barney was about 20 years old at the start of the Revolution. And he wanted to do something in the revolution as a young man. He could have served in the militia. He could have got into the West Indian trade, trading with the Caribbean colonies or countries, where you could bring back. That was a patriotic thing to do, because you might bring back gunpowder or some other thing that was needed by the patriots. You could have got into privateering, which was a rather risky thing, where you would arm a ship and with a few cannon and some armed men and go after British shipping, trying to take some sort of a cargo ship, overpower it, bring it into one of the prize ports like Bedford Village or New London, Connecticut, and then you could get part of the proceeds from that. It could be very lucrative, also very dangerous. But he chose to join the Continental Army, which was unusual. He joined with the Rhode Island unit and spent only a few months, 3 months, maybe 6 months, doing that. But he came home and decided to get into the West Indian trade. So he would trade with the Caribbean countries. That was also risky, because that was considered treason from the British point of view. The British were in Newport for a good bit of the first part of the war and patrolling this area. And on his first day out, he was caught by the British Navy. He was not very lucky. They were towing his boat to New York, but it was the winter, and there was a storm came up, and the ship, his boat broke loose, they managed to get to an island off the New Jersey coast, but just Barney, one other person, made it to this island of however many were on the crew. He was very lucky. Somebody saw him from the mainland of New Jersey and came over and rescued him. But by that time, he had lost a leg, or had to have a leg removed. It took him a year to recuperate. He did, and when he did, he went to Philadelphia and got into privateering. He organized a privateering boat and crew and captured a prize, brought it back to Philadelphia, and with the prize money, he paid back the people who had rescued him. On his next voyage, he was captured again and imprisoned in England. But they soon decided to send him back across and put him on a prison ship in New York. During this transfer across the Atlantic, he organized a mutiny and brought the prize, which was the boat bringing him back. That became the prize, and they brought that into Boston as a prize. Based on this success, he decided more of this will work, so he went privateering again, but he got captured again. And he spent 2 years on a prison ship in New York. 2 years. By then, the war was pretty much over, and he got into the merchant service, the same thing that he was trying to do before. And he made, according to family lore, he made 45 voyages to the West Indies over the course of 10 or 12 years. He wasn't married at the time. He just obviously spent most of his time at sea. But it's the last 2 voyages that are the most interesting. In 1793, he went to Africa, purchased over 100 slaves, and sold them in Cuba. Now, this was the classic triangle trade. He was working out of Newport. Newport was pretty much the leader, if you can call it leadership in this, where they would take Rhode Island distilled rum, go off to Africa, trade the rum for slaves, bring the slaves to the West Indies off in Cuba, and then take the proceeds of that in molasses and bring the molasses back to Newport to be distilled into more rum, and so it goes around. Slavery was still legal in the United States, of course, at this time. But it was illegal in Massachusetts, and it was illegal in Rhode Island that he was working out of. Furthermore, the slave trade was illegal. Even though slavery was legal, the slave trade was illegal in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And in 1794, the year after his first voyage, the slave trade was made illegal by federal law. His second voyage, also to Africa, to Cuba, back to Newport, was after the federal law had been passed. He was obviously successful with this. Most of the Newport people who were in the slave trade were, in fact, very successful. And right after that, he got married. Within 2 months, in fact, his second voyage, he got married. He was at age 40 at that time. He and his wife, Sarah Cook, had 12 children. And he lived a surprisingly long life as someone who had been through all that he had been through in his life. If we were to talk for 10 minutes, which is probably what I did, about 10 minutes on Barney Hicks, the first 8 minutes, he's a hero. In the last 2 minutes, he's a villain. Of course, we have to be very careful when we apply 20th century sensibilities to people who lived 200 years ago. Have to consider the particular conditions, prevailing attitudes, and so forth at the time. But Barney really presents us with a complexity that makes historical evaluation challenging. It's one thing to engage in the slave trade, as many people did who were trading with the West Indies. It's one thing to bring local, fish or meat or lumber or something down there, knowing that it's really to feed and provide for slaves, and to bring back molasses or sugar, which is produced by slaves. It's one thing, I think, to be involved in that. You can kind of distance yourself from that a little bit, saying, it's just business, I'm just doing trade. It's quite another thing to actually buy and sell human beings, which is really what Barney did. Again, a very complex hero or villain decision to be made. My third sketch is about Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey, of course, is familiar to pretty much everybody in Westport, a mariner, a shipbuilder, a philanthropist. We could discuss him for days. In fact, 4 or 5 years ago, there was a symposium on him at the Waiting Museum, which was 2 days of talks and presentations on Paul Cuffey. But I just want to concentrate on one really small aspect of his life, which was his desire to reverse the direction of the slave trade and to actually bring African Americans to Africa. He had a great interest in Africa for philanthropic reasons, as you might guess. Also religious reasons, the Christianized the heathens of Africa. But also commercial. Paul Cuffey was at heart a very ardent commercial man, a successful one too. And he wanted to set up a trade relationship with Africa, with certain African countries, bringing our products there and bringing palm oil and lumber or various other African products back here. He went to Sierra Leone in 1811. Sierra Leone was a British colony for slaves that had been freed. He stayed there for 2 months, got a real sense of Africa and Sierra Leone. He then went to England. He met with William Wilberforce and various other leading lights in the anti-slavery movement, the international anti-slavery movement. And had some great ideas when he came back, but the War of 1812 got in the way, and it wasn't until late 1815 that he was able to make his planned voyage. And when he did, he went back to Sierra Leone, and he brought 38 black Americans with him. 20 of whom were children. And the idea was that they weren't going to get a square deal in America. They could do some good in Africa, but also do some good for themselves by really getting away from the racism and prejudice that was hard to escape. The commercial aspect of this just didn't work out. He had to pay for most of the people that he transported. And he lost $8,000 on the venture. He was a very successful businessman, but he lost quite a bit of money on this one. But right after that, he got contacted by the American Colonization Society. Now, that was a group, a national group, that had as its idea to form a colony, which they did. It's called Liberia, still obviously a country in Africa, to send free black Americans to Africa. Same ideas, philanthropy, and Christianization. Many of the people who were the leaders of this were Christian ministers. But oddly enough, or maybe not so odd, most of the other people in this organization were slave owners. In fact, one of the vice presidents was James Madison, who owned about 100 slaves. Bushrod Washington, George Washington's nephew, also he was president of it for a while, and another slave owner. So they really didn't want to end slavery. What became obvious was that what they wanted to do was to get rid of those free blacks. They wanted the slaves to stay, but those pesky free blacks were a constant reminder to other people that you could be black and free. And it was to get rid of these troublesome people that they did it. This wasn't really apparent to many people at the time, including Paul Cuffey. The Colonization Society even suggested that when they formed the new colony of Liberia, that Paul Cuffey could be the governor. But around this time, 1817, when these ideas are forming, Paul Cuffey was in failing health, and in September of 1817, he died. So this leaves us with a question. Well, before I say that, this idea of colonization would eventually be denounced by black leaders. Frederick Douglass in particular, who wrote in 1849, "We are of the opinion that the free colored people generally mean to live in America and not in Africa. We do not mean to go to Liberia. Our minds are made up to live here if we can, or die here if we must." So this is 30 years after Paul Cuffey's death. So the question comes up, had he lived to hear those words of Frederick Douglass, might he have rejected his earlier support for colonization? I think he would have, just my own opinion. I think he would have agreed that his own experience, which was staying here, fighting for black equality, while making a commercial success of his own life right here in America, would have been the right approach. My fourth sketch is, I call it Slavery by a Different Name. It starts in 1792. A Westport man named William Howland, who was a captain in the maritime trade, was on a trip to one of the Caribbean islands. I've heard it was a Spanish island, heard it was a Dutch island, I don't really know. And he acquired an indentured servant, which was a 6-year-old boy by the name of Daniel Martin. We don't know what his original name might have been, but he got called Daniel Martin. Daniel Martin's mother was apparently paid for this. Whether she did it for money or whether she did it because she honestly believed that her son would have a better chance in America, we really don't know. But Daniel was brought back to live with the Howlands in Westport. His black skin and the condition of involuntary service, and certainly not voluntary on his part, makes it similar to the slavery that had only recently been outlawed in Massachusetts. Indentured servitude differed from slavery in that it was not for life. It was usually for 5 years, or 7 years, or 10 years, or until some particular age was reached, like 21 or so forth. And it was not hereditary. But in most other respects, the servant was under the complete control of the master. We don't know anything about what Daniel's life was like for the earliest years that he was in Westport. But we do know that around 1800, William Howland, the master, died. Daniel was 14 at this point. Instead of freeing him, they bound him to a further indenture with Nancy Howland, William Howland's widow. Daniel responded to this by running away at the age of 15. Not surprisingly, he went to sea to run away. Pretty natural for a seafaring town in Westport. He may have even had some seafaring experience because of his apprenticeship. Also, there was, while there was prejudice, racial prejudice pretty much everywhere in America, there was a rough equality aboard ship. If you could do your job, you typically got some respect and there was tended to be less discrimination aboard ship than there was on land. Daniel's escape actually started off pretty well. He joined a merchant ship called the Caledonia in 1802 and 1803. They went on a voyage to China. So a real adventure for this young, still a teenager. He was on that for a little over a year, got paid relatively well. And then he was on a merchant ship called the Neptune, an American ship. They were in the Bay of Biscay off of France in 1805. They were approached by taken really by a British naval ship, and he was impressed into the British Navy. You probably heard of impressment, where the British would say, they'd board a ship, like an American ship, and they'd say, we think some of these people are British deserters from the British Navy. We want them back, and they would take them back. And they took him, mistaking him somehow for a British deserter. So he was forced into service in the British Navy, which was really bad service under any circumstances. He was on a ship called the Melampus, a British warship, for 15 months. At that time, after 15 months, the Melampus was off the coast of Virginia. They were chasing a French ship up into Chesapeake Bay. And there was a party going on aboard ship, and 4 men, including Daniel, thought it was a great opportunity. They jumped on one of the small boats and made it to shore, so they were able to escape. He realized that the safest thing for him to do was probably to enlist in the U.S. Navy, and he did. And he was assigned to the naval frigate Chesapeake. This turned out to be bad luck. The British warship Leopard was cruising around there, went after the Chesapeake and asked to come aboard. The naval officer came aboard from the Leopard and demanded that Daniel Martin and 3 others be given up because they were British deserters. They were refused, and as soon as the naval officer got back to the Leopard, they started firing immediately, caught the Chesapeake completely by surprise, and it was a very short battle, an embarrassingly short battle for the Americans. And Daniel and 3 others were taken. This Chesapeake Leopard affair is very significant in American history. It's really one of the things that they point to as a direct lead-up to the War of 1812. Daniel was brought to Halifax, where he was tried, and he was sentenced to 500 lashes. Luckily, that was commuted, but this was a very serious business. One of the 4 was hanged as a traitor. The U.S. authorities verified that he was indeed an American. They actually wrote back here and got a deposition from a couple of people, including his former mistress, Nancy Hahn. And they worked hard. The State Department worked very hard to free him. And they did. It took 5 years. But he was either in British prison or aboard British ships as an impressed sailor for 5 years. In 1812, the British brought him and dropped him off at the Charlestown Navy Yard. As it turns out, the Chesapeake, the ship he had been on, was in the Charlestown Navy Yard at the time, and so he goes back on the Chesapeake and becomes the crew member there. 11 months later, the Chesapeake had to face off with the British frigate Shannon, and the Shannon defeated the Chesapeake, and 48 Americans were killed, and one of them was Daniel Martin. So in his 27 years, he experienced very little freedom. From 6 to 15, he was a servant against his will, and he had a few years, 15 to 19, in China, France, and various other places. Probably his best years, looking back on it. And then from ages 19 to 27, he was in forced military service or in British prison. So, except for a few years in his teens, his life really, a short life, but it was a life of slavery under other names. My last sketch, I was originally had another plan for the 5th sketch. I was going to talk about Edward Duvall, who was a Westport whaling captain who had been very successful until he had run into some bad luck and made some bad decisions, and got involved in the slave trade out of New Bedford in 1860. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized I wasn't going to do it. One reason is that it's a very complicated story, which is great, but there's no way to summarize it in 10 minutes or so. The other thing was, it was just too depressing to end the night on. These are great stories, and as I go through them, I said, I can't do it. So I looked for something that was very positive, and I found something, and a lot of it thanks to Ben, who had done some previous research on this. This is a story beginning on a whaling voyage of a ship called the Mattapoisett out of Westport, under the command of George Manchester. He made 2 voyages in the 1850s. We think it was probably the second one, 1857. Whaling vessels, when they went out into the Atlantic, the South Atlantic, typically went to the Azores and then they'd head southward and then stop at various islands along the coast of Africa and elsewhere in order to replenish their supplies, get fresh water, and so forth. And one of those places that was often stopped at was called Annobon Island, which is about 200 miles off the coast of Africa. It was a Portuguese colony at one time, it was a Spanish colony. It's actually part of Equatorial Guinea now. While the Mattapoisett was anchored in the harbor at Annobon, a young African man swam up to the ship and asked, or begged, to be rescued from his enemies, who he said would either kill him or sell him into slavery. Captain Manchester agreed. Somehow there was communication. It could have been because one of the languages spoken in Annobon was a Creole or Portuguese, and there were typically a couple of Portuguese sailors on most whaling ships, on many whaling ships. But in any case, he was able to communicate. They gave him a name, as often happened on these whaling ships. If they picked up foreigners or Pacific Islanders and so forth, they typically gave them names, not always very good names, but they gave them names maybe because they couldn't pronounce them, or just some sort of feeling that they should have a more American name. And they gave him the name of Tom Awful. They also gave him a job. He was the cook. So it wasn't all bad. And he went on the rest of the voyage as the cook, as a crewman. And when the Mattapoisett returned in 1859, Tom settled in Westport. He was a fisherman, made his living as a fisherman. In fact, there's an 1863 newspaper that I saw that reported that Tom Awful had caught 270 pounds of cod and tautog off of Westport. So he was a fisherman. But at some point, Tom created his own American identity by adopting the very American name of John Stevens. John married a woman named Minnie Rose, who was a Wampanoag woman from the Aquina group in Martha's Vineyard. They owned a house. They were successful enough. They owned a house at Westport Point. They had 8 children. 5 of whom lived to adulthood. We know a little bit about a few of them. Bessie and her husband ran a tea house at Westport Point for some years. And Warren and Leland, the 2 sons, were chauffeurs. Warren for the Southern family and Leland for the Dunham family. They were very proud of their work. There are wonderful photos of them in the Historical Society collection in their uniforms, in these wonderful old open cars. Just absolutely beautiful photographs. And they were treated with respect in town. In fact, many people would remember Leland in particular because he lived here in Westport until his death was in 1984. So he lived well into our time frames. One person was particularly grateful for the Stevens family. Charlotte Finch's mother, well, many of you remember Charlotte. Charlotte Finch's mother was saved from drowning at Horseneck Beach by Warren Stevens. And for that, she gave him her father's gold watch. She carried very proudly. When John Stevens asked to be saved by Captain Manchester, his life hung in the balance. his voyage from Africa to the New World was in the same direction as the slave trade. But in his case, it was a rare voyage to freedom. Thank you. Any questions? Comments? Betty?
I don't think I can do this justice, but, you know, at the symposium, there was a lot of talk about whether Paul Cuffey had the idea of sending blacks back to Africa, or whether he was sending black craftsmen back to help the people in Sierra Leone in order to gain the ability to do something else other than chase down other blacks and send them off as slaves.
Right.
So, you know, David wrote a whole paper on this. And then the Colonization Society, it's not clear that he ever really accepted. They wanted him.
They wanted him, but you're exactly right.
The question is whether he wanted them or not. And he was sick and traveling and so forth. So it's a question of whether he was trying to send blacks back to Africa or sending blacks to work with Africans to give them an alternative, I think.
Betty's absolutely right. The people that they sent all had skills of some sort. They were craftsmen, they could do things, and they were trying to bring. And the religious aspect was also important to Cuffey. He was very about a Quaker. He was interested in Christianizing Africans as well.
I have a question. In the first talk, the men that were freed after 4 years or 3 years or whatever, when a slave is suddenly freed, how does he earn a living? He has nothing, does he?
Well,
was that period of 3 or 4 years a time for him to adjust and prepare himself for freedom, or what?
What would often happen, at least in the best of circumstances, was that they might continue to do the same work for the same people, but with wages, and also not getting the kind of support that they might have got before. But they would do it. So it really turns into wage labor. In some cases, though, and Dinah White is a perfect example of that, where she didn't have skills anymore. She was quite old, I believe, and she was left with no resources whatsoever. And so that was the downside. And so you can find both cases. Somebody like Zip White was able to get work of some sort, whereas Dinah White could not. So it could go either way. Richard?
Yeah, Zip White was given a 10-acre farm by Sylvanus White, who was George White's son, in 1784, and it says where he's still living. So sometime before then, you know, he already had a 10-acre farm on the north side of Shalati White Road, which is where Shalati White later lived.
That's right, where they're buried, in fact, up there. I didn't know that. That is terrific information. Betty?
Well, Cuffey's father, Cuffey Slocum, bought a farm almost immediately after he was freed, but he was making wages through the period. And where he made his money, I don't know. He did very, very well. He bought 2 farms after being enslaved. So they had ways of getting working as well.
Yeah, well, if they had skills, a lot of them didn't have skills. They had learned some sort of skills, and they were able to apply them, again, in a wage labor situation.
We see movies of how slaves were treated in the South. Was that common in the North as well?
There's a real difference. I mean, there was bad behavior. There was bad treatment and good treatment all over the place. But the primary difference was that slaves here were typically in small groups and families, in 1s and 2s and 3s, because we didn't have plantations. The plantation system was the most brutal. There's no question about it. People they worked harder, they got overworked, they didn't live as long. Whereas here, they were typically living with a family, and the conditions were clearly better. It's still unfreedom, any way you look at it, but the conditions were better. There were some cases, though, I mean, Rhode Island did have some pretty good-sized plantations. And so there was some of the plantation system up here. As a general rule, they were in smaller groups, tended to get treated better. and less brutal than it was in the South. As a rule.
Just like one other.
Betty, please.
Have you run into, in your research, the name Peter Gordon? There's a Peter Gordon cemetery in the north end, almost on the Fall River line. And he is black, and he was a farmer, and it's the only stone that's there, is Peter Gordon. And I've seen him in the censuses from 1790 on with the other Gordons, the white Gordons. At first he's in a column by himself, you know, and I think...
There was a slave in the 1790 census,
Yes,
there was a
the
slave column.
the slave, and then he just became a black, or a people person of
Yeah.
color. But I've never been able to find anything else about him except that.
Never had it.
The other is London, Richmond. Richard, London,
Probably
Richmond.
connected with the Richard family.
Yeah, the Richard family.
Who had land at Coxet.
He actually had land here before Cuffy and all of these people. I've seen deeds of land here. That's another name, London, Richmond.
Okay.
He probably was a slave of the Richmond.
Of the Richmond family. Yeah.
I can't find anything about them.
No, I don't. This is exactly what we want here, is that people following these various threads and finding out more and more. A lot of it is census records that trigger things, but then every once in a while, a cemetery will sometimes tell us something's wrong. That's really what we need. Yeah.
One of the many things that I think is so valuable about these kind of collections is that growing up in New England, we were always taught that slavery was a southern thing, that somehow we had no role in it. And I'm involved in the history of the textile industry in New England, and found out that the manufacture of Negro cloth, which was a rough fabric that was shipped down south to clothe slaves, was everywhere in this part of New England. That huge fortunes were made on the furnishing of Negro cloth, which was a rough kind of cursive, fabric. And I find myself wondering, because I know about various Negro cloth mills in Rhode Island, but I'm wondering if we had any up in this neck of the woods. I crossed the border to be here.
I don't know, when I read about Negro cloth, it usually comes out of Rhode Island. I mean, that was kind of the center for that. It was, again, I was talking about the Caribbean trade, that in a way was supporting slavery just by trading with the Caribbean nations. What Ned brought up of making cloth here that was low, cheap cloth, but sturdy, that was used for making clothes for slaves. Anybody in the textile business, of course, was mostly using cotton, which was slave produced. And there were so many ways that New Englanders were involved in this. And if you ever read about the slave trade, it's Rhode Island, it's Newport and Bristol, Warren, those places were the leaders in the illegal slave trade, just like Barney Hicks was. And Barney Hicks got drawn into, somehow, I'm still trying to figure out why, what his connections were, but how he gets drawn into the Newport slave trade. It's absolutely awful. Illegal, didn't matter. There was corruption like you wouldn't believe of officials, and everybody just kind of let this go. As if somehow it just really didn't matter.
It's also very fish.
That's right, exactly. It was part of the business. You know, if you're a fisherman here, you want to sell that dried cod down to the Caribbean. It's just business. I think a lot of people do that. It's just business. There's money in it. Again, with Barney Hicks, the thing that's really bothersome is how do you make that leap from being someone who's just doing business to somebody. He was not only the captain, he would be, the captains were also the supercargos, the guys who did the actual buying and selling. He was the guy buying and selling those slaves. It's really harsh. And how somebody makes that leap is what's that?
It's not that far.
Maybe not. Maybe.
They wanted to get married.
Yeah, that's right. He got out. The typical voyage, it was dangerous too, because people would the more time they spent on the African coast, the more there was a chance of getting malaria or yellow fever. And a typical captain in all those years in Newport during the slave trade, made 2.5 voyages. So he made his 2 voyages and then got out because there was a chance of disease. And he made a lot of money. One other thing I'll mention, there was one guy, a Newport guy, who was in the Caribbean trade, and he would typically make returns of maybe 3 or 4% on his investment on this Caribbean, just regular trade. It was a tough business, paid for himself, but he didn't make a lot extra beyond that. He said, I'm going to try slave trade. He made 2 slave trade voyages. I think the first one he made 20%, the second one he made 35%. So it was money. It was so lucrative to do it. People could just put the moral scruples away.
At an event I went to at the Whaling Museum once, I was talking to a Cape Verdean guy. I knew a little bit about it, and he was telling me that the Cape Verdeans played an incredible role in the whaling industry.
Yes, they did.
That they were really, really good.
Yeah.
And were prized, and I don't get the feeling that I get the sense that they were gay and everything, that there was, it wasn't servitude.
Yeah.
Are there any cases where Cape Verdeans joined the whaling fleets, ended up in the States, and then found themselves through some misfortune or another in slavery? Or?
No.
No.
None, put it this way, none that I know of.
Yeah.
They often did come here. In fact, a lot of New Bedford with Azorians and Cape Verdeans originally came through the whaling industry, and they did pretty well. They were usually highly respected for their skills, their maritime skills. A lot of them were good harpooners, for example. They typically, there was always a limit though. There was a certain, you could go to a certain level, but very few of them, for example, when you have.
Yeah, and harpooning was one of the most dangerous
It
towns
was one of
on
those
the whale.
things, yeah, exactly. Thank you very much.